Hi, Misfits. This is Kate, and it's just me today. Welcome to Horrorwood. Yes, Kevin is still out. He's going to be out all month. So today you've got just me. And before we get into this case, I don't really have a ton of news, but I do want to mention, in case you haven't heard it on a previous episode, we do have a new tier or category or whatever they are called on Patreon, where you can go ahead and pledge the entire year. And by doing so, you get 20% off. So if you'd rather not pay the monthly fee, you can go ahead and do the whole year and get a little discount. So if you want to do that, you can pop on over to patreon.com/horrorwoodpodcast. And we've mentioned it before, but do it via the website, because if you do it through the app, Apple likes to charge a 30% fee. So that's just a little tip from us to you to sign up on the website as opposed to the app. Without further ado, let's get into this case. It was Thursday afternoon, January 31st, 2002. Around 2:30 p.m., Adriana Piñon said goodbye to his teenage daughter, Adriana, and headed off to work the night shift at his job. Adriana's mom, Rosalia, went to work in the mornings and worked all day. And on that day, around 4:30 p.m., just a couple of hours after Efren left, Rosalia called Adriana from work just to check in. She knew her daughter was going to be home all day and was just calling to maybe let her know what time she'd be back from work, or maybe ask her what she'd like for dinner. Typical mom stuff. But when Rosalia called, no one answered. The phone rang and rang, but Adriana never picked up. And that was unusual. Rosalia knew Adriana was there, so why wasn't she answering the phone? Perhaps it was her maternal instinct or female intuition, but when Adriana didn't answer or return the call, Rosalia got worried and decided to leave work a little early. She thought, I just want to make sure everything's okay. Around 5:30 p.m., Rosalia pulled up to her house in Lomita, a neighborhood in southeast San Diego. And the first thing she noticed was that their big wrought iron gate out front was open. She never left the gate open. And the padlock to the gate was missing. Rosalia is already feeling uneasy because she hasn't been able to get in touch with her daughter, and now she arrives home and the gate is open. But it's when she pulls into the driveway that the real panic sets in. She sees that her living room television is lying on the ground on the driveway. Rosalia runs inside and the place is ransacked. There are items missing, including the stereo. Things are torn up like someone has gone on a rampage. And she's thinking two things. One, we've been robbed. And two, where is my daughter? She's frantic. And when she walks further into the living room, she discovers a mother's worst nightmare. Her 18-year-old daughter, Adriana, was slumped over by the love seat, unresponsive and covered in blood. Rosalia grabbed Adriana, desperately trying to wake her up, but she was already dead. Rosalia called the police, which I can't imagine having to make that phone call, and when officers arrived, they cordoned off the home with yellow crime scene tape. Across the street, a grief counselor met with Adriana's family members, including her mom, her older brother Alfredo, her older half-sister Christina, and her dad, who had just seen her alive and well a few hours earlier. He rushed home from work when he got the news. The media began showing up, trying to get any information they could from the officers standing guard outside. Neighbors came out of their houses wondering what's going on. And this case has some eerie similarities to the one I did last week on Passionata Prince. The scene feels familiar, with a circus of officers, reporters, onlookers, and family members all wondering what exactly happened here and why. To find the answers, we've got to do what we always do, go back to the beginning. Adriana Piñon was born on September 23rd, 1983. She was the baby of a tight-knit Hispanic family. In the 1960s, prior to meeting Rosalia, Efren Pinon immigrated from Chihuahua, Mexico to Los Angeles for work. He married his first wife, who was also from Mexico, and they had a daughter named Cristina. When Cristina was 4 years old, the family moved to the Lomita neighborhood of San Diego, an area that is home to a primarily Hispanic population. About 4 years later, Efren and his wife divorced, and soon after, he met and married Rosalia. Rosalia had dreams of stardom. She wanted to become a model and took classes at the Barbizon School of Modeling. Barbizon has been around for decades with multiple locations, and surprisingly, they still exist. I've never taken classes there, so I can't speak to the quality of training, but from what I've read, red flags, red flags, red flags. It's one of these establishments that say, we can make you a star, you just have to give us a couple $1,000s first. Regardless, Rosalia took the classes, but ultimately, according to her stepdaughter Cristina, she didn't have the personality to chase that dream. By that, I think Cristina means that Rosalia didn't have the drive that's required to get started in that field. Getting photos taken, submitting to castings, going on auditions, dealing with rejection. You're basically working a full-time job just to see if you can even get a job. Rosalia decided it wasn't for her. She and Efren went on to have Alfredo and then Adriana. Cristina was 12 years old when Adriana was born. I get the sense that the half-sisters were close despite the age difference and the fact that they had different mothers. Cristina refers to Adriana as her baby sister, and they spent a lot of time together. Ever since she was little, Adriana was a fun, bubbly ball of energy. She was always singing and dancing around the house. She was the little entertainer of the family. When she was 10 years old, she became an aunt to Cristina's daughter, Clarissa. Clarissa loved her aunt Adriana, and the feeling was mutual. Adriana never missed an opportunity to play with her niece. They'd play dress up, and Adriana would do Clarissa's pretend makeup. And when you're a little kid playing dress up and you get to wear a little makeup, even something as simple as a flavored lip gloss, that's huge. You feel so grown up. Adriana would give her niece jewelry to wear and have her do little fashion shows around the house. And Clarissa said of Adriana, quote, "She was always the one that made me feel beautiful, that made me feel like I could be anything that I wanted." Adriana was also really close with Cristina, and by this point, Cristina is an adult. She's a mom, she's off doing her thing. But whenever she was at her dad's, which is also Adriana's dad's, and where Adriana lives, the two sisters would sit in chairs out in the yard and talk about boys and what kind of dreams they had for themselves, where they'd like to travel, and what kind of careers they wanted to have. Adriana followed in her mom's ambitions and had dreams of becoming a model and actress. And Rosalia really encouraged this. She saw in her daughter the same dreams she had, but could tell that Adriana had the drive and the personality to really go for it, to try and make those dreams a reality. It seems like everyone in the family saw in her that star quality, that it factor. When Adriana was in high school, Rosalia took her to a photographer to have professional pictures taken. And her photos were beautiful. She is not at all shy in front of the camera. She's about 5'10", has long dark brown hair and big brown eyes, and is very naturally pretty. If you go to our social media, you can see a photo of her. And Adriana was serious about pursuing acting and modeling. So serious, in fact, that in addition to her regular schooling, she started taking night classes so that she could graduate early and focus on her career. So she's very driven. She knew exactly what she wanted to do, and she had a family that supported her. I think especially living in Southern California, geographically, she's already so close to the entertainment industry. It's not like a kid growing up in Kansas who wants to make it in Hollywood but has to first figure out how they're going to move there. Being from San Diego, Adriana was just about 2.5 hours south of Los Angeles. San Diego is a beautiful city and relatively safe, but like any city, there are going to be areas that have a higher crime rates than others. This particular neighborhood where Adriana and her family lived was known to have a lot of gang violence, particularly during the 1980s and 90s when Adriana was growing up there. In fact, the high school she attended, Morse High School, was notorious for a double homicide that occurred on the front lawn of the school back in 1992. Lots of gangs, lots of drugs in this area. So for Adriana, the thought of the glitz and glam of Hollywood just a couple hours north made her work even harder. It was an escape, a way out. If she was successful, it could mean a better life, not just for her, but her entire family. As tempting as that life can seem for a kid living in Kansas or wherever, think about the kid who's practically living in Hollywood's backyard. It's going to make that dream feel that much more attainable, I would think. But it's not to say that Adriana was all work and no play. She was pretty well-rounded. Her niece Clarissa said she went out, she had fun, she had a lot of friends, she had a boyfriend, so she was really sociable. Adriana and Rosalia were always keeping an eye out for acting auditions and modeling opportunities, and Rosalia would drive Adriana wherever she needed to go for these. Since Adriana was a minor, by law she had to have a legal guardian with her. So if it meant driving for 2.5 hours to LA for a 5-minute audition, then driving another 2.5 hours back, that's what they did. In the summer of 2001, when Adriana was 17, Rosalia heard about an open casting call for The Young and the Restless. It was a casting call for extras, so non-speaking roles, but even though it was just to be in the background, it would be recurring. Any job in the entertainment industry that is even the slightest semblance of a regular gig is a great gig. These types of open casting calls, even though it's for a non-speaking role, is going to attract hundreds of young hopefuls. It's a paycheck, it builds towards your health insurance, you're on set, you're around famous people. This was around the time that Eva Longoria came onto the show, so this was a good job. Not only that, soaps are a great training ground for young actors because they shoot very quickly. They have to since it's a new episode every day. So it's a great study in memorizing quickly, learning to hit your mark, being able to go with last-minute script changes. It's a great way for actors to get their start in the business. And even as an extra, you're making good money because soaps will often shoot scenes from multiple episodes in one day. So for example, there's a coffee shop that characters on the show always go to. Let's say there's a coffee shop scene in 3 out of the 5 episodes for 1 week. The production might shoot all 3 of those coffee shop scenes in one day. But as an extra, you're paid your day rate per episode. So if you're in all 3 of those coffee shop scenes, that means you've worked 3 separate episodes. So you will get your day rate times 3 for 1 day of work, if that makes sense. So the money in soaps is good. Adriana went to the casting and was one of the few selected. She was elated. This was huge. Not only was she going to be working on a TV show, but it was a show she and her family watched. Christina said they grew up on Young and the Restless, so that made it even more exciting. She's one step closer to her dream. She's getting her foot in the door. And Rosalia really had to dedicate a huge chunk of her time towards Adriana's career because every day that Adriana needed to be on set, she had to have her parent with her. They would make the drive early in the morning to Los Angeles. Call times can typically be 6 a.m., 7 a.m., so when you think about that, they would have to leave their house around 4:30 in the morning to get on the road. Then Adriana would be on set all day working while her mom sat nearby and, I don't know, maybe read a book or something to pass the time. Then at the end of the day, they'd get in their car and drive all the way back to San Diego because they didn't want to spend money on a hotel. That would basically wipe out Adriana's earnings for the day if they did that. And when I say it's about 2.5 hours between LA and San Diego, that's bare minimum. With traffic, we're looking at more like a solid 3 hours each way. But it would seem their dedication and determination was worth it, because sometime that fall, not long after her 18th birthday, the producers of Young and the Restless pulled Adriana aside and told her they would be moving her up to a speaking role. Needless to say, when she found out she'd be getting upgraded, she was on cloud 9. That's the most you could possibly ask for in that situation. And it's not that common. If you think about all the TV shows and all the movies out there, then think about all the extras working on those shows and movies. My guess is less than 1% of them will be given lines. But the producers of The Young and the Restless saw something in Adriana. The busier she got with work, the less time she had for her boyfriend, Oscar Martinez, and he wasn't too happy about that. Adriana was independent and driven, and if she needed to be in LA for work, she went to LA for work. She wasn't the type to call up production and say, "Sorry, can't make it in today, I'm hanging out with my boyfriend." Like, you just don't do that. But it kind of sounds like that's what Oscar wanted her to do, or even expected her to do. He wanted more and more of her time, but her time was divided between her career, her friends, her family, and him. It was causing a rift in their relationship, although they were still together when the holidays rolled around. That Christmas, her sister Christina gave her a sweater, and Adriana told her, "This sweater is going to be famous because I'm going to wear it on the Valentine's Day episode." And Christina said, "It's not the sweater that's going to be famous, it's you." Christina truly felt that her baby sister had what it takes to be a star. After the holidays, Adriana was back at work, and her boyfriend Oscar wasn't too happy about it. He felt she should be spending more time with him. Adriana didn't like this jealous side of Oscar. It was bringing her down. And if she was going to be with someone, she wanted that person to be supportive of her. So mid-January, she broke up with him. He did not take it well, which made both Adriana and Rosalia a little uneasy. Rosalia was kind of like, I don't know about this, be careful. Like, she had her concerns about Oscar. But Adriana couldn't dwell too much on the breakup. She had a job to do, and she wasn't about to jeopardize her standing with the show because she knew she'd be getting upgraded to a speaking role soon. True to her word, when Young and the Restless shot the Valentine's episode shortly after Christmas, Adriana wore the sweater Christina had given her. But tragically, she didn't get to see herself on the screen in that episode because she was murdered just 2 weeks before it aired. When Rosalia couldn't reach her daughter that Thursday afternoon, January 31st, she knew in her gut something was wrong. As I mentioned at the top of this episode, the scene became somewhat of a circus between media and police and neighbors. Christina was at work when Rosalia found Adriana. And when she got home, she turned on the news. Just like part of her routine, it's around 6 o'clock. She gets home from work, probably ready to start dinner, and she turns on the news. And that's when she saw detectives at the front door of her father's house brushing for fingerprints. This is the house she'd spent so much time in, the house where she and Adriana would sit out front and talk about boys. I can't imagine turning on the news and seeing your family's home surrounded by police and crime scene tape. She didn't know what had happened. She just sees the house on the news, so she rushes over there. But officers wouldn't let her inside, so she joined the rest of her family across the street with a grief counselor, and that's when she found out Adriana had been killed. She had to break the news to Clarissa, who was just 8 years old at the time. Clarissa said, "My heart sunk into my body and I felt like I exploded." As I mentioned earlier, when Rosalia arrived at the scene, the gate to the driveway was open and the lock was missing, and the living room television was in the driveway, like maybe someone had dropped it. Inside, the house was ransacked. Rosalia noticed some things missing, like the stereo. Things were out of order, and it looked like they had clearly been robbed. Adriana was found wearing a white shirt, jeans, and white tennis shoes, and she was also wearing makeup. This is significant because her dad said that when he left for work earlier that afternoon, she was still in her pajamas, and she hadn't done her makeup or anything. She was just hanging out at the house. Adriana had a bruise just below her left eye and had died by a single gunshot wound to the back right side of her head, just above her right ear. Homicide detectives John Teft and D. Warwick, along with several other officers, arrived at the scene. Like Adriana, Detective Warwick was also Hispanic, and she said that she saw the closeness Adriana's family had, and said she could really relate to that because her family was the same. She said having that same culture as a Hispanic female, seeing that closeness they shared, she just really felt for them. When detectives walked through the house, they noted that the way in which things were in disarray seemed hurried and random. Furniture was tipped over, which I feel only happens in movie robberies, not actual robberies. Like, I don't think a burglar who is on a mission to steal valuables is walking through the house just nonchalantly knocking tables over and throwing lamps on the ground. And the only areas that seemed disturbed were the living room, which is where Adriana was found, and the kitchen, which is right next to the living room. The disarray was confined to those two areas. When detectives searched the rest of the house, the bedrooms, the closets, nothing was missing. Whoever did this hadn't gone through any drawers looking for money or jewelry. It appeared they hadn't gone anywhere else in the house at all. Detectives noticed a couple of other things. The padlock to the wrought iron gate was sitting on the kitchen table with the key still in it. Since Adriana was home alone that day, this suggested to the officers that whoever it was that did this was someone Adriana had let in. She must have known this person. And given that she had changed out of her pajamas and had put on makeup, suggests she not only knew them, but was expecting this person. Detectives found a .25 caliber cartridge case on the living room floor, but no firearm. On the coffee table were perhaps the best pieces of evidence detectives could hope to find: 2 glasses of iced tea that were still cold and had condensation on them. These glasses had not been sitting there long. If they're still cold, they've been poured recently. Between the padlock with the key still attached, the fact that she's dressed, and the 2 glasses of tea, detectives feel the house being torn apart had been staged. Whoever did this tried to make it look like a random robbery, but this was someone Adriana knew. Investigators were able to collect fingerprints from the television set that had been dropped in the driveway, as well as DNA and fingerprints from the 2 glasses of iced tea. They're thinking one of these glasses is Adriana's and the other is whoever she let in the house. So you can imagine their surprise when the DNA profiles from the glasses came back belonging to 2 different males. One male on one glass, a different male on the other. All of Adriana's family members gave a DNA and fingerprint sample, and none of them came back a match, so they can be ruled out as suspects. Rosalia gave detectives Adriana's address book that had all her friends' names and phone numbers, male friends, female friends, ex-boyfriends. So they start going through and calling each and every one, trying to find out as much as they can about Adriana, who she hung around with, what was going on in her life. And each person they talked to, they would ask for a DNA and fingerprint sample. Rosalia informed detectives about Adriana's ex, Oscar Martinez, and how she was concerned when Adriana broke up with him because he was not happy with the breakup. So detectives are definitely keeping him in mind as a person of interest. They brought him in for questioning, and he willingly gave a DNA sample and fingerprints. And when the results came in weeks later, and they compared Oscar's DNA to that left at the crime scene from those 2 glasses, Oscar Martinez was not a match. His DNA wasn't on any of the evidence left at the crime scene, so he was ruled out as a suspect. America's Most Wanted ran a segment on Adriana's case on March 2nd, 2002. It was getting a lot of media attention. Meanwhile, detectives are still going through Adriana's address book and interviewing her friends. There was one person in her book whose name was just listed as Junior, but there was a phone number. When they ran the phone number through the computer, they found the number was associated to a guy named Hugo Jimenez. Hugo was a friend of Adriana's. They were about the same age. He was a year older. He was 19. They'd hung out a couple of times. He'd been to the house and met her parents, but they weren't dating. Rosalia said they went out a couple of times and that was it. When Detective Warwick called him, she asked him about Adriana, if he knew her, and he was like, yeah, I know Adriana. I used to date one of her friends. He said that when he and that girl broke up, he and Adriana would chat with each other on a chat line. I'm thinking like a chat room or instant messenger or something like that. So they became better friends that way. They started hanging out here and there. He said they went out to eat a couple of times. It doesn't sound like they officially dated, but they hung out from time to time. When Detective Warwick asked him when the last time was he'd seen Adriana, he said it had been about 6 months. And when Detective Warwick told him Adriana had been murdered and asked if he knew who might want to hurt her, he didn't have any information and said he didn't even know she'd been killed. Detective Warwick asked if he'd come in and give a DNA sample and fingerprints, and he said yes. When he arrived at the station, Detective Warwick said she could tell he was nervous. She went to shake his hand and his palm was all sweaty. To be fair, if my friend had been murdered and I was called down to the police station to give a DNA sample, I'd be nervous too, even knowing I had nothing to do with it. He gave a DNA sample, and when they went to fingerprint him, as he turned his hand, Detective Warwick noticed that his thumb had cuts across it in a crisscross pattern, kind of like paper cuts. They were very thin. And she asked, "How'd you get the cuts on your thumb?" And he said, "Oh, I was working and I cut myself." And that was the only explanation he gave. She's like, "Okay." And after he gave the samples, he was free to go. As they looked further into Hugo, detectives learned that on January 17th, just 2 weeks before Adriana was killed, Hugo had been involved in a domestic dispute with a girlfriend. That didn't necessarily make him guilty of anything in this case, but it was something that they noted. And then a few weeks later, so this was 6 weeks after Adriana had been killed, the fingerprint results came in. And Hugo's were a match for one of the glasses of iced tea and the TV in the driveway. But Hugo said he hadn't seen Adriana in 6 months, right? So Detective Warwick and Detective Teft invite Hugo back to the station. They were like, "Hey, we just want to talk to you. You're not under arrest or anything, and you can leave whenever you want. We're just trying to get as much information as we can." So he's like, "All right, yeah, I'll come down." I've watched this interview. It's recorded, obviously, and let's just say he's not going to win any acting awards anytime soon because he is a terrible actor. When they confronted him with the fact that his fingerprints were a match for evidence left at the scene, he says, "My fingerprints?" And Teft and Warwick are like, "Yeah, and your fingerprints were on the TV." He says, "What?" He just seems in disbelief, like, "Not my fingerprints." Warwick says, "We also have your palm prints, one palm on this side of the TV and the other on that side of the TV." He says, "What? It can't be. I was never there. The last time I was there was like in August." The fingerprints aren't enough for an arrest because remember, there were 2 sets at the scene. And since they didn't find the weapon, they don't know if he was the one who pulled the trigger or if it was the person belonging to the other set of prints. Maybe Hugo was a witness. Maybe he's covering for someone. So they keep going after him. They're like, "Your fingerprint was on this glass of iced tea." Again, he acts shocked. "What? A fingerprint of mine?" Meanwhile, when he's giving his answers that aren't answers, he starts to rub his throat a little, like his throat hurts. With each question, he rubs his throat. Then he starts clearing his throat. The detectives start showing him photographs of the crime scene, like the living room, the TV, the padlock. But when Warwick showed him a picture of Adriana, Hugo turned away and said, "I'm not looking at that. I don't want to look at that." And this is when his sore throat suddenly turns into a cough. Detective Warwick tells him very directly, it's time to start talking about what happened there. She asks, "Did she call you or did you go over there? Like, did she invite you or did you just go?" And he says, "She called me." So he goes from haven't seen her in 6 months to she called me over. And then he launches into this story that he and his friend were driving to Adriana's house and were being chased by 2 guys. And when he got to her house, Hugo said he jumped out, told Adriana to open the gate quickly because they were being chased, so she opens the gate. They back into the drive, and Hugo tells his friend to wait in the car in case those 2 guys come. Hugo says suddenly he sees the 2 guys run inside Adriana's house. He says, "I saw them run in this door, so I ran out that door. I didn't see my friend anymore, so I took off." So, he's saying he and his friend were on their way to Adriana's. On their way there, these 2 guys randomly start chasing them for no reason. They got to Adriana's. Adriana opens the gate so they can pull in the car. He tells his friend to wait in the car. Supposedly, Hugo goes inside with Adriana, though he doesn't mention this in his story. And while inside, he sees the two guys come into the house, so he runs out in the other direction. His friend had apparently driven away, so Hugo just ran off, leaving his friend Adriana on her own with these two random guys. The detectives are like, cool, when did you have time to drink iced tea? Hugo says, oh yeah, I forgot. She gave us some iced tea while they're being chased and while he told his friend to stay in the car. But the friend somehow had time to get out of the car, go inside and have tea while the mysterious two guys are chasing them. And at the same time that they're drinking tea, the two guys come through the door and Hugo leaves out the back. And at that point, his friend had already driven away. He really didn't think his story through. So Detectives Teft and Warwick are like, who is the friend? What's his name? At first, Hugo doesn't want to tell them, but they're like, yeah, you're going to have to. Hugo gives them the name Brian. And then, craziest thing, that sore throat of his starts to flare up. He says, I gotta go. I need to go see a doctor. So he leaves. They can't hold him because they don't feel they have enough evidence yet. They don't know if he's the one who pulled the trigger or if it's this Brian guy. So after Hugo leaves, Teft and Warwick get in their cruiser and start following him. And turns out Hugo lived in a neighborhood very close to the Mexican border. So they start worrying that he might try to flee. And if he crosses the border, they're going to have a really hard time getting him back. They call the DA and tell them the info they have so far. And the DA says, you've got enough probable cause to arrest, make the move. Hugo had gone home, so they arrested him right there at his house. And when they searched him, inside one of his pockets was a piece of paper with the name Brian and a phone number. So it made the detectives' job of tracking down this Brian guy pretty easy. When they brought Hugo back to the station, they tried to talk to him more, but he said he wanted an attorney, at which point they couldn't question him further. Once you make the arrest, you have to present your case to the prosecutor within 72 hours. So they've got to get this case together. They've got to talk to this Brian guy, get his story, and they only have 3 days. Otherwise, they have to release him. If they thought finding Brian's phone number in Hugo's pocket was lucky, detectives were in for a real treat later that evening. They just didn't know it yet. During a routine traffic stop along the coast, which is a completely different part of San Diego from where Adriana lived, a young guy gets pulled over. When police search his car, they find a .25 caliber firearm. Police take it. It ends up in an evidence locker. It's later tested by a lab, and turns out it's not just the same kind of .25 caliber gun that killed Adriana. It's the exact gun. Detectives wouldn't know that just yet, though. Meanwhile, they run this Brian guy's phone number through the computer, which gave them the name Brian Aquino. He was just 17 years old. Since they needed to find out if this Brian kid was the other male whose DNA was found at the crime scene, they needed to interview him and collect a DNA sample. Technically, they could do this without his parents' consent because in 2002, when this took place, there was no specific law that required a legal guardian's permission to collect DNA from a minor. That has since changed. In 2018, which is pretty recent, California enacted a law requiring both the parents and the minor's permission before collecting a DNA sample. But the detectives in this case went ahead and talked with Brian's dad anyway, even though they didn't necessarily have to. I have to say Detective John Teft and Detective D. Warwick, both of whom are retired now, they were great. They are by the book, making sure all their T's are crossed and I's are dotted. They don't want to make any mistakes. Brian's dad was very cooperative, and the next day he brought his son down to the station for an interview. As they were questioning him, Detective Warwick noticed that every time Brian told a lie, he stuttered. When he told the truth, there was no stutter. I just thought that was an interesting tell that Brian probably wasn't even aware he was doing. Brian's story about what took place that day in January was wildly different from Hugo's, and detectives felt, as do I, that Brian was far more truthful about what happened. He said he drove Hugo over to Adriana's house. They both went inside. She gave them each a glass of tea, and they were hanging out in the living room. Brian said he sat watching TV while Hugo and Adriana were on the love seat chatting. According to Brian, Hugo kept trying to get physical with Adriana, but she wasn't interested. And remember, this is a friend of hers. They've hung out a few times before, but it wasn't romantic, although it sounds like maybe Hugo wanted it to be. Hugo becomes more aggressive, trying to make something happen with Adriana, which eventually leads to an argument. He starts slapping her, and as she's trying to shield herself from this, she falls to the ground. She's now crouched in the fetal position next to the love seat, and Hugo gets down and starts punching her, which would explain the black eye she received. All because she rejected his advances. She begs him to stop, but he doesn't. And he starts saying things like, oh, you think you're hot shit because you're an actress? You think you're all this because you're on TV? And then, as though it was the most casual thing in the world, he steps over her, pulls out a gun, and shoots her in the head. Then with zero emotion, he looks at Brian, who's been watching all of this, and Hugo tells him, we've got to stage this and you're going to help. At this point, I think Brian would have done anything Hugo asked because he's just witnessed him kill an innocent girl like it was no big deal. Brian was scared Hugo was going to shoot him. So they start throwing things around. Brian grabs the stereo, Hugo grabs the TV, which he drops in the driveway on the way out, and they drive off. Brian's story made a lot more sense than Hugo's, and it matched the evidence found at the crime scene. This is the end of March when detectives are interviewing him, so he has sat with this for 2 whole months. I'm sure he was terrified to go to police after it happened. He was probably worried he'd be killed. But I have to think that he saw the events of that afternoon replay in his head every day for those 2 months before finally spilling everything to the investigators. They arrest Brian for accessory to murder, and with both males in custody, detectives informed Adriana's family that they got him. The family was, of course, relieved, but I can't imagine being her parents and finding out that a guy they knew, that they've welcomed into their home before, that their daughter has hung out with, has gone out to eat with, was friends with, is the one responsible for her murder. And he had zero remorse. When detectives learned about that gun from the traffic stop and that it was a match for the one used in Adriana's murder, they needed to talk to the guy police had confiscated it from, because Hugo's defense team could come back and say it was that guy that committed the murder. They bring that guy in for questioning, who said he got the gun from a couple of gang members. The names of the gang members were not Hugo or Brian. These gang members had a criminal record, and detectives were able to contact them and bring them in for questioning. They said that a guy had brought the gun to them, told them it had been used in a crime, and he needed help getting rid of it. When detectives pressed them for the name of the guy that brought the gun to them, they said it was Hugo Jimenez. Things aren't looking good for Hugo, and he knew it. Initially, both Hugo and Brian pled not guilty to the charges against them, but as the trial date got closer, they both changed their pleas to guilty. Hugo pled guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to 40 years to life in state prison. In the courtroom, Adriana's family members and friends were given the opportunity to tell Judge Peter Day what Adriana meant to them and how the loss affected them. Rosalia said her daughter would have been a beautiful mother and actress, and added, I feel like we're the ones who were sentenced to die. During these victim impact statements, Hugo just sat there with a smirk on his face. After hearing from family and friends, Hugo's defense attorney, Mel Epley, told the judge his client had nothing to say, to which Judge Day replied, I didn't think so. The judge then addressed Hugo directly and said, quote, Mr. Jimenez, this is a very cowardly act. What you did is disgusting to me. With the life sentence, you won't be eligible for parole anytime soon, if at all. You don't deserve any better than that. His statement was published in the San Diego Union-Tribune. Brian Aquino pled guilty to robbery and accessory to a crime and was sentenced to 5 years probation with time served. So once he was sentenced, he was actually free to go because he had already served time, and so he was out. Brian has led a very private life since the murder and has stayed out of the spotlight, and from what I can tell, has not been involved in any other criminal cases. Hugo, who is currently serving his sentence at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, has a parole eligibility date scheduled for March of next year, according to the Cinemaholic. Adriana's death affected not just those in her San Diego community, but in Los Angeles as well. Producers of The Young and the Restless sent a beautiful plant to her parents' house. They sent flowers, and they placed a tribute to her in Soap Opera Digest, which goes to show how highly they thought of her. The inscription on Adriana's gravestone reads, Muñeca hermosa, which means beautiful doll, you will always be our star. And that is the case of Adriana Piñon. You can leave your comments on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or Spotify at Horrorwood Podcast, or send us an email at horrorwoodpodcast@gmail.com. And if you would like to throw a little extra change our way, you can jump on over to Patreon at patreon.com/horrorwoodpodcast. Thank you for listening, and we hope you tune in next week. In the meantime, don't do murder. Bye.